I also became a biblical and theological student, receiving my education from a famous private Christian university. Early in my academic career, I began to realize that the Bible we're holding in our hands today contains innumerable errors and historical inaccuracies. But despite its unreliability, I was charged to submit my scholarly work as though its claims were true. And above all, question nothing. But it was too late. I had been trained to question everything. And for the first time in my life, the facts that I learned about the Bible called into question everything I previously believed to be true, based on what others had told me. My life was plunged into chaos. Everything turned upside down. Everything I believed about God and myself was a lie. In a moment, everything was reversed. Was there anybody else out there like me?
Hi, I'm Brandon Long, and in 2006, I was licensed as an ordained minister. I was preaching and teaching all over the East Coast. There was nothing that I wouldn't do for God. I was on fire for Christ. Then, something happened. And today, I am the happy atheist. Background, grew up in a very traditional Christian home. Mom, dad, grandparents, the whole nine. Everybody was Christian. We all thought the same. Go to church every Sunday. All the major holidays, everything traditionally Christian. My beliefs back then, what the Bible said was true. How could you not believe in a God? Or how could you not believe in Christianity? Like, well, what do you believe in? Like, well, where does your morale come from? It's just so many questions. Try not to get offended.
Where storytelling meets journalism. What up, everybody? Arael Avinu here with Fully Deconverted. I'm so happy to be on here with everybody. You can find us at fullydeconverted.com, and all our social links are on there as well. In our last interview, we spoke with Andrew of the Atheist Roundtable, who reminded us that atheism is humanity's true gospel. But today, we're speaking with David Fitzgerald, author of Jesus, Mything in Action, who just might tell us that there was never any biblical gospel in the first place. So let's head over to David and see what he has to say about everything. David, what's going on, my friend?
Hey, Ariel, how's it going?
It's going great. So introduce yourself and tell our audience a little bit about you.
Yeah, okay. So my name is David Fitzgerald, and I'm most famous for being the author of a book called Nailed, 10 Christian Myths That Show Jesus Never Existed at All, and the series Jesus Mything in Action. And also the Complete Heretic's Guide to Western Religion series.
So that already sounds like, what? What an incredible book series. Like, how did you, come on, like, who is your marketing person coming up for all these book titles?
It's all an atheist miracle, I tell you.
All right, David, down to business. What's more plausible, David? What's more plausible that kings, popes, emperors, scholars, archaeologists, historians, and devotees over the past 2,000 years worship something that did not have the authentic origin story which it claims, or that you have mistakenly identified a false narrative in the history of Christianity and seek to undermine its credibility because you are a spiritually inept atheist? Is everybody else wrong and you're right?
Well, let's break that down a little bit.
Yeah.
First of all, this isn't about me. This isn't even about me being an atheist. I mean, yes, I am a big old atheist. Yeah, I do wish religions would stop being silly and go away. But let me make it super clear. There's nothing implausible about there being a Jesus. Nothing plausible at all. Do I think there was a Jesus based on what we know? No, not at all. Not whatsoever. And one more thing. Being an atheist and being a mythicist aren't the same thing.
Okay.
You can be a completely happy atheist whether there was a Jesus or not. You can be an agnostic on the mythicist question, whether there was a Jesus or not as well. For me, I'm perfectly happy saying, yeah, just knowing what we know, I don't think the guy ever existed at all. And even more, if there was such a guy, for all extents and purposes, Robert Price says this, and I can't repeat it enough, there's not a Jesus anymore, because everything we know and think we know about this first century Messiah figure has nothing to do with anybody who was actually alive in the first century. So that's it in a nutshell. It's like, if you want to say, if anyone wants to tell me anything about what they think Jesus did or was or said, first thing you have to ask is, well, what's our sources for that?
Yeah.
How reliable are those sources, and how connected are they to what really happened?
Well, let's start there then, David. Let's go with the thing that every Christian has right now, which is a Bible. Okay, so
Right.
What are some areas of study that a lay person or a Christian could focus on in order to gain understanding on a historical or mythical Jesus? And like, I'm looking for like just an itemized list right here. What are some areas? What are just some things they could look into?
For one thing, take all your Lee Strobel books and all your Josh McDowell books and put them aside.
Those are two often cited. Hey, you need to read Lee Strobel and
Josh McDowell.
Josh McDowell.
I'm sure they're both lovely people, but as book writers, as authors, as fact distributors, they have got a lot of serious, many problems. And I can't tell you how often a Christian will come up to me in all innocence and think, oh, I'm going to shut this atheist down, and then just parrot what they've heard and just get schooled, and it's like, I'm not trying to be mean, I'm not trying to be a dick, but literally every single thing you've said is wrong. Boom, and then explain what's happened. And it's like, it's shame. It's not even shame on them. It's shame on the people who are lying to them, and to the theological interests that compel the academics of biblical studies and Jesus studies.
Well, that sounds like you're calling all of Christian academia kind of to the line right there with that statement.
Well, here's the thing. It's not even that they have a bias. Of course they have a Christian bias. We have an atheist bias. That's not a problem. We all have biases. What's the problem, especially in Jesus studies, is how much of those biases are affecting Jesus scholarship. I ask in the book, people, because that's one of the first things atheists will come up to me and say, well, how come all biblical scholars accept that there was a Jesus? And there's a couple of answers to that. One thing is, well, when you get all the biblical scholars in a room and divide it between the secular biblical scholars and the religious-minded biblical scholars, you've already got two Jesuses right there that debunk each other, that are totally incompatible. And if you get those secular biblical scholars, if you've got 50 of them in the room, you've got 50 different Jesuses that they're talking about.
Yeah.
That's one thing. But one question I ask in Jesus Mything in Action, and the reason that we have so many biblical scholars who reject mythicism, I say that's the wrong question. We don't need to ask that. We need to ask how many of them are contractually obligated to publicly reject mythicism. And when you ask that question and actually crunch the numbers, and we went out and we did for every single learning institution in America, how many of them that offer relevant courses require your academics and your students? And boom, that changes everything. That changes the whole dynamic right there.
We just missed the punchline to that. You cut out for like 3 seconds.
Sorry.
So you surveyed those institutions, and what was the result?
We surveyed every single one in America and asked how many of them require their academics to sign off on a statement of faith, a condition. How many of you are required contractually to be Christian, always believe every Christian, and reject mythicism publicly?
Yeah.
And that changes the whole equation.
Yeah. Do you know any numbers of that off of hand? What was kind of like?
Absolutely. Yeah. Of all the institutions that offer any kind of relevant studies, almost a perfect 60-40 split is already religiously affiliated. That's
Gotcha.
enough right there to show the bias.
Yeah.
When we ask those 60%, do you require your academics to believe XYZ, 1 through 10, and we gave examples of that. The first thing that happened was a full third of them said, oh, yes, they have to. And I thought, wow, that's shocking, but that seems low. the second thing we found out was those are just the people who are willing to openly admit that they have that. When we looked a little further, the number went as high as 2/3, and it may be high as every single one of them.
Yeah.
And I would love for somebody else to do a study just picking that and digging a little deeper on that. But the math is there. The numbers are there. The majority of biblical scholars work for Jesus. And as a quote I use in the book says, it's hard to get a man to believe in something when his salary depends on him not believing it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I can quote at least one university. It was the private Christian university that I went to, where you had to make a statement of faith, and it's all kind of laid out in that. So, and I used to submit my work and get it censored and I was a hardcore Christian. But like I was asking the questions, right? And they would censor my work because all the students can see your work and everything when it becomes available for publishing.
That's shocking. But I actually have like a half dozen case studies in the book, not about atheist scholars, but believing, devout Christian biblical scholars who have gotten their careers in hot water for saying things that aren't anywhere near as blasphemous as saying Jesus didn't exist. I hear you.
All right, what are some other areas of study a lay Christian or anybody could look into if they're wanting to find a historical or mythical? So far we got Don't Read Lee Strobel or Josh McDowell.
Or if you do read them, read some counter arguments of them too, because they sound very convincing. The amount of bluster and smugness oozing from those pages is off the chart. But when you actually kick the tires on those books, they fall apart instantly. It's almost embarrassing how much they do.
Yeah.
And same for the movie that came out just a few years ago, Case for Christ. That
Didn't
thing's
see
a real
it.
propaganda fest too.
Yeah,
well,
I imagine.
you're really missing out. You would actually appreciate it. Because the thing is, that movie presents the myth of Lee Strobel, not the real Lee Strobel, but how he wishes things had played out.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me to see him just recreating his own history there.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
But anyway, these are rabbit holes we're going down just to stay on target. We should have Christians who are interested in this actually look up the history behind these writings that they have as scripture and all the other Christian writings that didn't become scripture. That would be an interesting place to start too.
That is an interesting place. Yeah.
Yeah. And in my book, Nailed, I start with 10 questions that all point to how the official story of Christianity just doesn't hold up. And there's so many things that Christians take for granted, like, oh, these were written by Jesus's 12 pals. They were eyewitness accounts. They all died for their accounts. And it's like, and none of those things is true. Absolutely none of those things is true.
Yeah.
And when you actually look at the evidence and the corroborating evidence for early Christianity, I've got a chapter in there called Can Jesus Be Saved? And I said, okay, this is how things would have to look differently in the New Testament, in early Christianity, just in Roman history in general, for there even to be a guy named Jesus. And again, there's nothing implausible about that. There's nothing unrealistic about the thought there could have been a Jesus or many guys like that. But I don't think that's the case based on what we know. Based on the evidence we have, it seems like he's well, here's the thing. All our so-called biographical information for Jesus doesn't come from outside the Bible. It comes from the New Testament. And specifically, it doesn't even come from the epistles or from Paul's letters or anything. And all those Bibles are taken from... You still with me?
Gotcha now.
Looked like I lost you for a second. Okay.
Gotcha now.
What'd you miss?
All the biographical data that we have for Jesus comes from, and I'm just imagining you're about to say the Gospels.
That's right. From those 4 down. But those 4 Gospels boil down to really the one Gospel, the first Gospel, Mark, our most low frills, shortest, human and sad Jesus that we've got, the most frail, earthly Jesus we have.
So let me stop you right there, David. Let me stop you right there, because now,
yeah,
any Christian that carries their Bible around in their hand, goes to church, and even talks to anybody else about Jesus is going to point to probably John to teach somebody, where they want to learn something new, that sort of thing. Maybe they'll jump into Matthew. Maybe they'll go to Mark. I don't know if they'll go to Luke. But so are you about to call into question I mean, the heart of what is Christian evangelism right now?
Oh, we haven't even started yet. We haven't even started. Yeah. Not only am I going to do that. I mean, there's a reason Christians love John, is because John, his Jesus, is a 3 generations advanced super Jesus.
Yeah.
He's a Superman without a Clark Kent. He's practically walking around for Judea with "I am God" on his T-shirt. And, I ask in there, it's like, was there a rock shortage in Judea at that time? How come he wasn't stoned for blasphemy right out of the gate?
Yeah. Yeah, good point.
But when you read the first gospel that all those other gospels and others that didn't make the cut in the scripture were based off of, you've got a very human Jesus, a fallible Jesus, a Jesus who gets cranky sometimes and can't quite get his act together. And when he dies in agony and in suffering. And he wishes he wouldn't have to.
Yeah.
And he becomes God. He becomes exalted to Lord only after his death, for being obedient unto death. That's when he gets promoted to God.
Now, it sounds like you're making a distinction here that Jesus wasn't God right there, and you just said it with your last sentence. But Jesus was... Yeah, okay, so Mark... And why are we drawing attention to Mark first?
Because Mark was clearly the first gospel that we have.
Why?
And there's multiple reasons to think that. The synoptic problem, for one thing, clearly shows that Matthew and Luke, the other synoptic gospels, are taking their basic story from him and just expanding on it, correcting his mistakes, adding things they want, taking things out that they don't feel embarrasses them or doesn't present the Christ they want to present. John comes later still, and his Jesus is, as I say, he's a super Jesus. He never feels doubt at all. He's also very anti-Semitic, which is a weird thing for the King of the Jews to be. But he's definitely generations removed from the original story, as all of them are. Even our first oldest gospel was written generations after the time it portrays.
What kind of timeline are we working on here?
We're talking very late first century. The oldest parts of Mark, our first gospel, had to have been written right after the Jewish war with Rome. The rest of the gospel could be even later still. But that makes the earliest our gospel could have appeared is around the year 70, between 70 and 74, 75, around that time, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the destruction of the temple, and all the other gospels, Matthew, Luke, coming a generation later. Luke, from the things that he steals from Jewish historians at the time, from books written around the year 94 or 93, means that his gospel couldn't possibly have been written anytime before the 90s, and probably 10 to 20 years after that is a more realistic figure.
Why? What's one indicator?
Well, there's multiple indicators, and I talk about them in Jesus Mything in Action. I actually break them down, studying what Josephine scholars have said, because there's so many parallels to Josephus. Either Josephus is stealing from Mark, from Luke, or Luke stealing from Josephus. But when you examine those connections and those parallels, you can see, in every single one of these cases, Josephus has the actual story. It's in the same context. It's the information is complete, and it makes sense. When Luke is he's stealing things from there willy-nilly, just as window dressings for his story, and he doesn't always get the facts straight, and he never has it in the right context. It's all just window dressing for his story.
All right, and so let me push pause on this right here, David.
Sure.
So who cares? Who cares that they're exchanging stories over and kind of meshing the facts, even if they get a couple of details wrong? What's wrong with propagating?
I lost you for a second there.
Okay.
So what does it hurt if they don't get it right? Is that it?
Well, yeah. Basically, who cares if they're sharing and they get a few details wrong? Does that discredit their story?
It does when their stories are either A, in lockstep, and then B, completely incompatible. Because this isn't differences in eyewitness testimony. I can't stress that enough. It's not Mark saying, he wore a blue T-shirt, and Luke saying he read a red T-shirt. No, this is basic contradictions in what he was, who he hung out with, what things happened in his life, why they happened in his life. For instance, just for one example, John's gospel. The whole reason he crucified is because he raises Lazarus from the dead. And it freaks out the establishment. They can't stop it. He's got this super huge following, and no one can stop him, so they kill him. Well, Lazarus doesn't even appear in the other three Gospels, except
Yeah.
as a name of a fictional character in one of the parables. But he gets killed for completely different reasons in the other Gospels. When you match up like the last 3 weeks of his life in the Synoptic Gospels and John, there's a parallel universe. And one, he's marching towards Jerusalem, getting bigger and bigger multitudes. Another one, he's on the lam and hiding out. They just completely incompatible. And Christians who say, "Oh, but these details are so good," yeah, keep reading all those details, because there's points where they are worlds apart.
Yeah, but Christians are going to say that these different gospels are just giving us different kind of portraits of the same Jesus.
Except they're not. They're making completely. They're starting with the same Jesus, and then they're taking it in completely different directions. And John, by the time John starts his story, he's not even trying to make his Jesus match up to their basic story. He doesn't care. It's like, temple cleansing, I'm going to put that at the beginning of his career, and that's going to kick off his 3-year career. The other guys, that's the very end of his 1-year career,
Yeah.
There's just, and it's, again, I can't even stress, it's not minute little details, little piddly things that could go either way. It's basic, crucial things. For instance, we don't have a single Christian text, full stop, that agrees on who the 12 disciples were. Not a single one. There's not a single one. They have to assemble them all together and jumble it and play a guessing game. And that's why when you see the lists of the apostles, some of them have 3 names and 2 names. And one of them, and most of them have 2 different names because, for instance, Matthew Levi is Levi and Matthew stuck together to make a new character.
Yeah.
And that's repeated throughout Christianity.
Let's take a pause right there. I just want to greet everybody over into the live stream and thank them for joining. Heat Shield, yep, see you every time. So sweet. How you doing? Brian Stevens, what's going on? Shane, hello. Nick Thomas, what is up? Thank you guys for joining. I'm glad you guys can hear the conversation between David and I right now. Violet Joy, what's going on, guys? Glad to see you out there. Kevin, what's up, my friend? All right, David, let's continue on. You said something that was a little bit interesting to me. We start off with Mark as kind of the program, and then you get Matthew and Luke, who want to kind of run an editorial process on this and say, you know what, we can make this a little bit better.
Yeah, and they weren't trying to write their gospel. They were trying to write the gospel. Each one of them wants to make... I mean, Luke is explicit about it. He says, in our generation, there's so many people writing gospels now. It seemed to be a good idea to go back and get the real story and which is a lie, because all he's doing for the most part is stealing from Matthew and Mark's gospels. But he's the only one even pretending to do a history. The other ones are clearly, Mark is so clearly an allegory. It's frightening how obvious it is in hindsight. When we don't look at it through our Christian goggles and just look at it for what it's saying, all 4 gospels are so different from anything we would expect. And I'll give just one example. Right at the beginning of Mark's gospel, he has Jesus say this thing to his followers in Mark 4:11. He says, "Now I'm teaching you in parables so that you'll know the straight story. But I speak that way. That way the Lord's outside, they won't understand. Otherwise," and get this, "they would turn from their sins and be saved." It's
I remember that.
That makes no sense for our Jesus. It makes perfect sense if you're talking. When you look at what Paul says, you look at the Gospel of Hebrews, we are talking about a celestial Jesus. Still with me? I think you blanked out for a second there.
You cut out there for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that I want to repeat that because I want to make it very clear.
Go for it.
When we're talking about Paul, when we're talking about every Christian writer before the Gospels are written, we are talking about a Jesus who is a mystery faith Jesus. He is a savior, just like all these other pagan saviors in this movement at the time called the mystery faiths. Christianity is a Jewish version of the mystery faiths.
Okay. Give one good supporting example of that other than what we've already discussed, because if you were to say that to a Christian, they're going to look at you with a blank stare like, what the hell are you even talking about? And because first of all, David, very, very, very few of us, unless we have expertise in the area, don't know anything about the culture at that time. So give us a little insight into the historical and cultural context of Jesus.
Absolutely. And let me see if I can unpack this fine. The thing about early Christianity you got to know is the Gospel of Mark is such a watershed because after Mark and before Mark, we have at least two radical different kinds of Christianities. Before Mark writes this allegory about what if God was one of us, you don't see people talking about Jesus as being some guy who lived on Manger Street in Bethlehem and hung out with these 12 guys and was betrayed by Judas. And, all the stories that we have glommed onto for Jesus, I hear them talking about that. Their Jesus is up in heaven, or he was at the creation of the universe, or he's going to go down and he's coming very soon. He's always coming. He never says anything about coming back. He never talks about it being a second coming. They're always saying when the Lord comes. And when you see what their source of their information is, it's never, Peter told me this and John told me this. It's always, I learned this through visions from heaven and from reading the scriptures, the Jewish scriptures. Everything he says about Jesus is followed by that caveat, according to the scriptures. We know that Jesus died and was buried and rose from the dead according to the scriptures. They're saying that constantly.
Okay.
And when they talk about, go ahead. I was going to say, when they talk about what an apostle is not a disciple of Jesus. Paul never uses the word disciple in any context ever, let alone implies that there are other people who actually had a relationship with Jesus, either friends or family or disciples. He says, and the other Christian writers before the Gospels, they say apostles are people like him who have had these visions, who can point to Scripture and hear Jesus talking to them through Old Testament verses.
Okay, I've never looked at it that way, and I've never paid attention to that particular detail. Okay, so let me see if I understand you.
Okay.
Paul is talking about Jesus and Christianity, and he never makes mention to what otherwise we take as the biographical account of Jesus, as we learn in the four Gospels. Right. And, all right, thought we almost cut out there for a second. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I saw that flicker.
Yeah.
Even like, there's like a few elements, and I'm thinking like the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper, I should say, because he never calls it Last Supper, he calls it the Lord's Supper. Even when you look at that, you look at the Greek in that, that's a lot more ambiguous than what we're led to believe. And what's more, Christianity is not the religion to have a Lord's Supper. There were many of them at the time. In fact, Paul warns us, you can't go to their Lord's Supper, you have to go to our Lord's Supper,
Was that another Lord's... Yeah, with like other religions? Lord's Supper with other religions, or different sects within Christianity?
No. Pagan religions like ISIS and we still have the invitations to those things, come pray, join me at the Lord's Supper for so-and-so, for ISIS, for Mithras,
Okay, so the Lord's Supper 2,000 years ago was kind of like a master class today. Anybody can have one.
Well, and another funny thing about when we think about it for 2 minutes, it's like, if you're a historian who thinks there really was a Jesus, well, then clearly that the Lord's Supper story is bullshit, because Jesus wouldn't have known ahead of time that he's starting this ritual that's going to become, the ground plan for this religion that goes on after his death. A Jew is not going to tell people, drink my blood, eat my flesh. That's a non-starter right there in Judaism. But as a pagan knockoff, as a pagan copy, it makes perfect sense, because we know they had those kind of meals. The pagan religions did.
Okay, so we're getting some of those elements incorporated into what is becoming or is early Christianity. And so, David, it sounds like there's just a lot of parallels between...
Time out.
Okay, we'll see if we come back here in just a second. And looks like we might be back.
Now, what were you saying?
Okay, so looks like there's parallels then between Christianity being birthed into the world and all the pagan religions around it at the time, which is, I've heard that argument, but it sounds like you're leaning on that pretty heavily.
Well, I mean, I don't have to lean on it, but the evidence is there. And in fact, when you look at how hard Christian apologists just try to poo-poo that whole thing, it's kind of ridiculous. Reading their things, their baptism was completely different from our baptism, blah 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 blah. Right. It really gets funny trying to deny that this has happened now. And some people will say things like, "Oh well, Christianity is not a copy cutter of this, because they did this and we did this," or all our evidence for it comes after Christianity. It's like, yeah, dude, but these were around for thousands of years, hundreds of years. Just because our only evidence is what Christians were talking about it, that doesn't mean it was invented later. Christianity was invisible for the first 300 years or so, socially invisible. These were major religions that spanned empires and went through, thousands of years, if not, centuries for sure, but probably at least 1,000 to 2,000 or 1,500 years before Christianity.
So it sounds like you just said Christian scholars just have their blinders on when it comes to...
Oh, big time.
Yeah.
Big time. And the thing that drives me crazy as an atheist, amateur biblical scholar, is when you're reading these standard works, and they'll say something like, for instance, the book of Acts leaves much to be desired from a historian's standpoint, but from a theologian's point, it's so rich. And it's like, whoa, hold the brakes. Like, you're saying it's not real history, but it's an important book for theological reasons. It's like, come on. And I see that kind of mental gymnastics all the time.
Yeah.
And you'll see them say the most crazy thing, and then turn around and say, oh, but of course there really was a Jesus, blah, 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 even though fill in the blank here. It's it. Yeah.
All right. So let's go back to Paul. He is one of the greatest. Are we good? Okay. He's one of the greatest arbiters about for the Christian faith. Isn't his life and ministry, as recorded in the New Testament, a testimonial account of the historical Jesus? Where do we find discrepancies there? I know we already touched on it.
Right. Well, first of all, Paul never tells us anything about the historical Jesus. Even if there was a historical Jesus, Paul freely admits that he doesn't have any connection to him, and even according to the official story, he has no connection to him, I should say. But when you talk about everything we know about Paul, well, everything we know about Paul is kind of in two big parts. It's what Paul tells us and what Luke tells us about Paul. And just about every single point where those two things overlap, Luke is lying about Paul. And everything we love about Paul is coming from Luke.
Yeah.
And everything Paul says either debunks that or it's clearly obvious not, when the real Paul is a bitchy little unpleasant, martyr. I could go more about how unpleasant Paul is and some of his problems.
Yeah.
In the I don't know if you've seen my Sex and Violence in the Bible talk, but
I don't think so.
It's worth checking out. That's going to be my next book in the Complete Heretic Guide series. And I talk about not even trying to be a bitch about it, not trying to be mean about it, but that Paul was probably a homosexual and did not like girls, did not like women. He liked Barnabas, he liked Timothy, he liked his slave boy Onesimus, but he doesn't seem to like girls very much. And he wishes all men could be like him, perfectly willing to withstand the temptations of women. And anyway, it's very ironic that the most hateful homophobic religion out there comes from this hateful homophobic man who was almost certainly gay. And I'm by far not the first scholar to say that too.
So I've never drawn that connection. I've never imagined that. But as you say it, there are some indicators there that I can recall with his interaction with other men and his, what do you call it? I don't know, decrees to his constituents.
Oh, sure.
And,
Sure.
but
why would you go get married to a woman? Something silly like that? Why would you waste your time? Lost you.
Yep, we cut out there for,
there?
let me see, I got your voice back, and looks like we're back on.
And we're back. Right.
Okay, so let me push back on that right there.
Yeah.
The Jews were still having hard times, though I'm not sure what time frame we're working at and how safe Paul is and how safe other Jews are. But one argument that I heard, hey, just be, don't take on a wife, don't get married, don't do these things. Because it's just going to end in grief. Look at us; we're going through a hard time.
Ostensibly because there's no time. Because the Lord's is coming anytime.
Yeah.
Never says coming back. but the Lord is going to be here any minute now, tick-tock. So we just don't have time to get married or silly things like have a wife, you know.
And so are they jumping on the hype of that? You know, and you know, the Jews are being scattered and dispersed and everything?
Well, that's happening after Paul's time because, again, everything in the New Testament, everything in the Gospels happens after the destruction of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And there's interesting anachronisms in our Gospel stories that show that they're talking about, they're like generations removed from the events they're describing. And they're depicting a life that happened once Judaism moved up into the Galilee following the destruction of Jerusalem, where the Pharisees, who would have loved somebody like Jesus in real life, the Pharisees, not only did they hate the Sadducees and the Roman fat cats, Jesus was exactly what they were looking for, and he even teaches things they were saying. You know, they talk about, oh, he does not teach as the scribes and Pharisees does. No, that's not true. He's actually quoting them many times in his teachings. They're stealing them from the Pharisees. But in the time after that, the time in the late first century, in the early second century, the Pharisees are the Jews leaders. They're the ones who are in conflict with early Christians and with other sects like John the Baptist, which was another rival of Christianity. And we can see that in the Gospels as well.
Why are we calling John the Baptist a rival Christianity?
Another rabbit hole to go down. John the Baptist religion, for the first 100 years, it was a rival to Christianity. They weren't on the same team. He wasn't baptized by John. They were telling different stories about who the Messiah was, and the Baptist sect up until at least the second century. Though, to be fair, there have been descendants of that original John the Baptist sect that have survived all the way up to today in Iraq and Iran on the fringes. And they may still be around now if Saddam Hussein didn't kill them all off during his regime. But it's kind of mind-blowing to Christians to realize that wait, aren't they supposed to be, first cousins and stuff? It's like, the Gospels don't even agree if they lived at the same time. There's a scene in Matthew where John in prison sends his followers to talk to Jesus and say, are you the Messiah, or is there another one to come? And then 3 verses later, Jesus is giving a speech about from the time of John the Baptist until now. It's like, whoa. You were just talking to him 2 minutes ago. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
So there's all these funny little anachronisms that show that this story is being written, generations after the fact.
Gotcha. What about the apostolic and early church fathers? And what about Peter, upon which the church was built? When we go to Matthew 16, 13 through 20, and Peter's the first pope, right? So,
right.
So what about the account that we get? Yeah.
What's funny about that is Mark is not a member of the apostles. So then they said, oh, well, he was Peter's secretary. That's why he's in the gospel, and that's why his gospel is so important, even though it's shorter than the rest. And the others have more information about Peter, including that little snippet right there. You think Peter would remember that bit, that Jesus told him that he was going to be the rock on which he'd build his church. But no, it didn't happen that way. The thing about the apostolic criteria is this is talking about something that was going on in the second century, where anybody who was writing a gospel, writing an apostle, epistle, an acts, an eclipse, all of them were on the same playing field. Nobody could say that, Matthew really wrote this, John really wrote this, because those guys didn't exist in the same way. There were Jerusalem church leaders, Paul, John, Peter, but they were leaders of the Jerusalem church. I lost you.
We just did our mandatory 5-second cutout.
Right. It's the man trying to keep us down. Yeah. Where did I stop?
You were going into the apostolic fathers, everybody being on the same playing field.
Yeah, because the guys that we think of as Jesus' friends and family, the leaders of the Jerusalem church, that's what they were. They were the leaders of the Jerusalem church. Mark took them and made them characters in his gospel. But those guys originally didn't have, there was no chain of succession. But in the second century, That's the only way you could have any kind of authority is, well, this came directly from Jesus, handed down by his apostles, And so you've got all these gospels, like our original all of our 4 gospels were originally anonymous. The Gospel of Mark was originally the good news of Jesus, the Son of God. That was the title.
Yeah, but David, they're called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What are you talking about?
They are now. Yeah. And it's funny thing about that too, is they're called according to Matthew, according to Mark, Luke, and John. That's a convention in ancient times of this is the tradition being handed down from that. It's not the gospel by Mark. It's not the gospel by Matthew, the way ancient authors did and the way we do today. They were already saying something much different, that this is something that's been handed down to us.
Okay, so these are traditions being recorded, and then at some point the name goes over it.
And when we say at some point, we're talking late 2nd century. Like by the mid 2nd century, we're already talking 100 years plus after Jesus' death, supposedly. We still don't have those names attached to any gospels. They're still floating around, and there's many gospels in the mix. And it's not until way at the end of the 2nd century, clearly 150 years at least after Christianity is meant to have started, that we have 4 gospels, and only 4, and that they're by these names. And and I can go on more about that too.
All right, but before we do, let me push back on something that caught my attention before. So we don't really have maybe a strong recorded history of the apostolic, or what we call or refer to as apostolic fathers right now. But and I can't verify this, and I don't remember verifying it, but when I was going through university, we drew an analogy about how do we follow the succession of church fathers. And
I'm dying to hear what they had to say.
Yeah. So we can think of it today, like when you go to a university or any kind of institution, we hang up all the pictures of all the founders. This guy founded first, this guy founded second, and there were those traditions which carried on all the way back to, let's say, Peter and the other regional churches that were springing up around the area. And that's the way they were able to determine the authority of Scripture versus Scripture. It's because they could trace those back, and that was, I don't know exactly the method, but I've drawn a correlation there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the official story. The official story was, okay, we're the Orthodox Church because we trace this all the way to Jesus. The problem is the heretics were doing that too. They also claimed this goes all the way back to Paul, back to this back to Peter, back to Jesus. Everybody was claiming that.
Yeah.
The question was, how do you know? And if it agreed with what you thought, then that was clearly the real one, And and Bart Ehrman has done a great job of showing how all our existing New Testament texts from that time. First of all, we don't have anything from the 1st century at all. For most of the 2nd century, we just have little scraps that'll fit on like half of a credit card, that size. It's not till the very end of the 2nd century that we even get complete books of the New Testament. And we don't get complete New Testaments until the 4th century. And that's 2 books, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Only problem with that is they don't agree with each other. And they have books we don't have. We have books they don't have. So it's even stickier still. So the problem with this apostolic succession is there is none. It's it's all bullshit.
Okay, and so effectively, based on the facts that you just said, sure, yeah, it's bullshit now.
Sure. But even when you trace what they're saying, like what the Catholic dictionary says, even they start getting shaky and hazy. It's like, well, we know Peter was the first, and then maybe it was this guy, maybe it was this guy, and ancient tradition claims you are making stuff.
Coming back.
The internet again.
Yeah, that was like
the internet.
That was like a 7-second one right there. David, hit pause. I want to go over into the live feed and see what we got going on right here.
You got it.
I'm just going to pick a random comment. It's probably going to be out of context because you guys are chatting over here. So Sweet says, it is kind of fascinating slime. Okay. I wish I had...
It is fascinating slime. He is right.
I wish I had understood how easy it was to make homemade when my kids. Okay, okay. That was a tangent conversation. Sorry, so sweet. Just calling things out. Let me see. There's a whole, David. There's a whole conversation over here about slime. I don't even know what's going on.
No, this is not Nickelodeon. Get back, people. Get back.
Violet Joy says, interesting how none of this is taught in churches. Let's go down that tangent, David.
Thank you.
Why?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. You know, even like the most basic things, like the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's like, I remember as a Christian, my pastor quietly off the cuff telling me, yeah, they probably didn't write it. And that blew my mind. It blew my mind. It's like, wait, you know that? And I mean, there's a reason when people get out of seminary that a certain percentage of them just like, oh, I'm done. We're out of here.
Yes.
Yeah,
That was me as well. Going
before,
through university, helped me along my deconversion process. That started springing up all these questions in academia.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to look at what the real history of Christianity is, and just how, like I said, in Nailed, I just do the top 10 things, and already that's enough to just blow this whole thing out of the water.
Yeah. But if pastors from the pulpit tried to say, let's say, try to address your top 10, and I'm not sure what your top 10 is, but I'm sure they're great, and they went and they tried to tackle it, do you think? Yeah. Do you think a lot of their congregation would be like, yeah, but you know what? I think we need to look into that top 10 a little bit more. Can we get to the bottom of this? How many people would kind of fall out, do you think?
Well, here's the thing. I think they, in their bones, they know this already. That we should not look too hard behind the curtain of this.
Yeah.
And we should poo-poo it as much as we can, and they do. Yeah. And yet it's just like, dude, it's just right. It's your book. I'm just reading it, and it says this. Why that? Unless these things just don't add up.
What are two things in your top 10?
Oh gosh. Well, where's my book right now? Hang on. That the eyewitnesses wrote it. That the idea that there was no Jesus is ridiculous. That it's corroborated by history. It's corroborated by evidence outside. That Flavius Josephus, this ancient Jewish historian, vouches for all this.
Well, let's go there because that's one of my questions.
Yeah.
So in regards to the historical and cultural context, which we've already discussed somewhat, don't we have contemporaries who do corroborate the Jesus story?
Short answer, no. We have nothing contemporary whatsoever. Short answer, no. Longer answer, still no. But, the closest thing we do anything corroborating Jesus in the entire first century is two disputed passages in Flavius Josephus, this ancient Jewish historian's writings. One is this commercial for Jesus that sticks out in the middle of this chapter like a Britney Spears video in the middle of a funeral.
So we think it got inserted?
We think it got inserted. Clearly it's a Christian spin on Jesus. And the argument, nobody thinks it's not a forgery. The argument has become, well, yeah, it's a partial forgery, and there was something about Jesus originally written, but they twisted it. And they've got all these convoluted reasons they pull out to say that, and none of them hold up. Long story short. And one of the main reasons it doesn't hold up is for 300 years, early church fathers loved Josephus. Nobody mentions this thing.
Yeah.
In 300 years later, somebody starts mentioning it. One guy mentions it 3 times, and then nobody for another 200 years mentions it. So for half a millennia, only one guy knows about this book. Even though his name one of the fathers, Elisha.
Yeah, we'll come back in just a second.
Still there?
And here we go. David, pause right there because I want to say, you got that 500 years, half a millennium right there, right? And then some guy right in the middle is like, oh, but wait, look at this. So that was the marketing guy that got hired on for a little bit of PR, right?
Yeah, and I spent a whole chapter breaking this down, so it's hard to unpack the whole thing in just 30 seconds. But,
Okay, so we got our earliest.
That's everything for the first. That's the whole century. That's it. We got nothing for the first century. Long story short.
Yeah.
And when we do start having corroboration, first of it, it's that there's Christians basically. It's not anything that's not being preached in the second century. It's not anything that clearly has been fact checked. And a lot of things that Christians pull out as eyewitnesses, you really need to read what you're saying as an eyewitness, because when you read it, you're not going to like what it says about Christianity, and it's not saying what you think it's saying either.
Yeah.
It's talking about how gullible Christians are, for instance, or how they'll believe anything, and how this guy wrote most of their scriptures, even though he's a drunken asshole, that kind of thing.
And what you're referring to right there was other kind of like contemporary historians. Is that who you were just referring to?
Well, we can't even use the word contemporary because, again, there's nothing contemporary to the time of Jesus.
Okay.
There's loads of historians around there. Philo of Alexandria, there's plenty who were talking about things going on contemporary to Jesus, including things going on in Jerusalem. But somehow everybody missed everything about Jesus. And for the whole first century, that trend continues, so much so that Christians had to forge a passage in Josephus to make up for it. And then after that, 100 years later, 100 years after the fact, then you start getting people talking about what Christians are saying about Jesus,
Okay, so you have the biographical accounts of Jesus doing amazing things.
Yes. And they get more amazing as the Gospels go on. The first one is pretty amazing. Second one, super amazing. That's super duper amazing. Super awful amazing. And there's books that didn't make the cut, like the Gospel of Peter, where it's even more amazing than what we've got in John.
Yeah.
Where you've got like a 500-foot tall Jesus coming out of the cross, the grave.
So
and a talking cross.
Is the trend then that as we see documents being produced or originated at later dates, Jesus just becomes more larger than life?
Not only that, he becomes better and better and more perfect and more Jesus-y. But we also see competing factions trying to change what Jesus says and what he preaches. And Bart Ehrman says something about the most remarkable thing about early Christian writing is the amount of forgery in it, and how much it's doctored and taken this way and that way to make it say what they wished it really said.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, and another thing, one more thing about that, I should say, is we still have multiple versions of our own Gospels. For instance, we've got multiple endings of the Gospel of Mark. We've got multiple endings to the Gospel of Luke, and we don't have any way of knowing which was the original or if they were the original. Because one other problem for early Christian texts is for the first 100 years, we've got nothing. Most of that century after that, we've got nothing, and then we start getting little snippets and fragments of something.
Yeah.
That's the problem. There's this complete blackout period where we don't know what the original text said. We just are left with these later texts that are clearly doctored and don't agree with each other. And we don't have any real way, and Christians don't either, of knowing what's the right interpretation, what's the right, not interpretation, but the right reading of it, which is the correct one, which is not.
Okay, David, you're blowing my mind just a little bit.
Let me blow it one foot further. And let's say by some magical, black box, all the originals were in a box somewhere and we just found them. We wouldn't know they're original. We would say, oh, here's a weird variant of Paul. Here's a weird variant of this. It was like when the Nag Hammadi Gospels were found from the 3rd century, including one that's a gospel. It's a pagan book that's being turned into a Christian gospel. It has this one pagan teacher and his disciple asks him the question, and they're making it, Matthew asked Jesus this, and Jesus says the exact same thing. I mean, and it's only half done. That's why it's such a perfect smoking gun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this is the thing, is we don't have any way of knowing.
Here we go, ladies and gentlemen. Here's our 10-minute commercial, or a 10-second commercial right here. Make sure you like and subscribe.
And we broke the internet again. Yeah, we just don't have any way of knowing what the originals are, and Christians don't either. So when you hear them pull out a number like, oh, our Gospels are 99.999% to the originals, like, you were pulling that number out of your ass, Christian boy, because there's no way you would know.
Okay, so the Nag Hammadi texts, date back to the 3rd century. Is that where we have it at?
3rd century, yeah.
Okay,
and that's just one example. I mean, yeah.
And then we have other texts that we have also date back to that same time. Yeah, correct so far?
Well, I was going to say, we've got older texts from the New Testament, but they're only partial for most of the 2nd century.
Yeah. So, okay. So
and it's not until very close to the end of the 2nd century that we get full books of the New Testament.
Yeah. I don't know if anybody has ever encountered the hubbub about the Nag Hammadi text, but that's kind of claimed, isn't it, David, from your perspective, by Christians as, this just kind of more testifies to Christianity. Christianity has this coherent message where, we have texts that go back there, and, we found them fresh, in the over in Nag Hammadi, over in Egypt somewhere.
Scrolls and, yeah. Oh, that's adorable. That's adorable when Christians say things like that. I don't know what to tell you.
With thousands of texts that tell the story of...
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. When they talk about, there's so many more texts of Christianity than there are of the Iliad, and it's like, oh my God, it's such bullshit. It's such bullshit. That's pure Lee Strobel bullshit. Because, we have more texts than that. We have about 24,000 texts. But you know what? If we had 24 million texts, we're talking about 8th century, 9th century. We're talking about medieval monks. We're talking about, texts that were copied after copy after copy after copy in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
When you look at how many original texts we have, how many root texts we have, then we get down to 2 or 3 or nothing. Our textual evidence chain ends 100 years before the actual documents are meant to have shown up.
So in other words, you're saying at some point we had the opportunity, availability, and intent to just mass produce something.
Absolutely. Christians did. And what's even more bad for Christianity about this is once Christianity became favored by Constantine and later emperors and became they were the ones who were in charge of what got preserved and what got neglected or failed to preserve or even outright tossed into the fire or the trash.
But that was through the inspiration of God.
Yes, an inspiration of somebody, for sure. So, it's rich for them to say things like, we have so much evidence, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, it's like because you guys burned it back in the day. Things you didn't like.
Okay, so we have not these originals, and then some fragments come along, and then we have a couple of codexes. So how does that minimize then the value at the Nicene event at 325 AD, where you have these professionals come together and start formulating what becomes the universal Christian narrative. Right. And then you have books that are agreed upon, affirmed, or at least we can look back and see some documentation that we're in some sort of agreement at very late 4th century with Hippo and Carthage, where we start getting our New Testament, that sort of thing. Doesn't it look like Christianity has a coherent message, and they're just kind of pushing out the bad guys, the actual heretics?
Well, that's the official story for sure. But it's funny for me is when you talk about the Council of Nicaea and all these later ecumenical church councils, by then, when you're talking about like the 3rd century, for me, that's way too late. It's ancient times for us, but for examining the origins of Christianity, you are like 200 years, 300 years too late to get at the real gist of Christianity.
So at that point, they're just consolidating power.
Exactly. And you even see that Rome is what's, the Church of Rome is starting to dominate everything. Anyway, that's a whole different other story. But when we get back to the origins of Christianity, everything that we have, doctrines that are set and established, none of those were established yet. They were all up for grabs. It's like we have questions about Christianity. They had 10 times more questions than we did, 100 on
like and subscribe.
Where'd I lose you? That commercial break.
They have 10 times more questions. Let's hit a pause right there. Let's go back over into the live feed. What's up, Beach? What's up, Jennifer Brewer? What is up? I'm trying to pick a name I haven't seen yet. Alias, fake name. Oh, that is cool. Somebody has the
If
name.
that is
Alias
his real
fake
name.
Alias fake name, since I just recognized that name, says there are 600 million copies of Harry Potter. How many more before he becomes historical? All right. That's a good point. Jeff Sir, what's going on? If only I could afford the books about this. Cry face someday. ...
Ask your library to carry them.
Seriously. Exactly, David. That's what I do, guys. If there's like a book or a series or something, I love walking to the library with my sons, and I do that. Like if there's a series I know, I'll ask them to pick it up. It might take a couple months, but you can just pick up something else along the way. Anyways.
Oh, and if anyone's more into audiobooks than written books, Jesus Smithing in Action, I just finished wrapping up books, volume 2 and 3 of that book, so it'll be out any minute now. I mean, I was literally working on it right up until the time we started this show.
Nice. David, what will be out? The audiobook or those volumes?
The audiobook of Jesus Smithing in Action.
Who reads it?
Nailed. What's that?
Who reads it? Who narrates it?
Oh, I do.
Oh! There you go.
So, if you're loving this golden voice, you're in for a treat. We got hours more of this. Hours more of this.
Beej says, one story that gets me is people coming out of the graves. In Old Testament, everyone is supposed to do that. So I got put in the New Testament as a few people. I'm not familiar with the Old Testament story. Maybe the bones, that might be an Isaiah
right,
story.
Right, the bones of Isaiah, exactly.
Okay, so what about that?
Two verses in Matthew, and it blows Christians' minds when I cite them. I've been accused of being a straw man, of creating a straw man argument by just saying what it says in those 2 verses. That all the saints in Jerusalem came out of their graves and walked downtown Jerusalem, appearing to many. It's like, I'm not making this up. That's what it says. And it's like, no, this, and there's other Christians whose minds have also been blown and have suggested that, well, maybe this is just apocalyptic imagery and not really meant to be taken literally. And he almost got his career lambasted for that.
Right, because then you're going from biographical account of Jesus, it's supposed to be a biographical account, to, okay, now we're going back over to what, allegory, or, and then what else?
And allegory, that's the killer word. It's like, because these biographies are clearly allegories. I mean, there's no question about it. Verse after verse after verse after verse after verse, you see it. And you see, like, when Matthew makes differences to Mark's, usually it's to fill some other prophecy or Old Testament thing. For instance, it's like, Christopher Hitchens said one of the things that clearly shows that there's bullshit going on is that one side says he was born in Nazareth and one side says he was born in Bethlehem. And the fact is, you're right, it is bullshit, because both these sides, Mark says he was born in Nazareth because he had verses that he wanted to bring up. Matthew wanted it to be born in Bethlehem because he had prophecies that it fulfilled, And there were other places that, there were early Christians who thought he was born in Cana, for instance. Things on the periphery that don't make it into mainstream Christianity. But it's like, okay, why was anybody saying anything like these crazy things over here if we all knew this already?
Yeah.
And that's something else that comes out in the book, is like, there's Christians saying things that are just crazy. It's like, wait, haven't you read the Bible? Don't you know that this is what happened? It's because there wasn't a Bible then. There wasn't a New Testament then. Nobody even thought to create a New Testament by the time they were writing these things down.
The everybody coming out of their graves was always an account that stood out to me, and I always wondered why we didn't give that more attention. Whether it's in our local Bible studies. Again, I was a Christian for 20 years, and I was involved in ministry heavily throughout those 20 years. And then just the fact that we were talking about contemporary historians a little bit earlier, like, how the hell do we miss this? You got Rome right there.
Thank you. Well, I mean, even Rome's not super close, but I mean, Judea was.
I mean, not Rome, but the occupation. Looks like we just
I lost you.
Yeah,
I lost you.
We're coming back. Rome occupied. That's what I meant.
Like and subscribe. What were you saying? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we got
we've got historians talking about things that were going on in Jerusalem there that are a hell of a lot less interesting than zombies, appearing and having a zombocalypse. We've got messiahs from that period who are boring compared to Jesus, and yet every single one of these guys over here did something Jesus couldn't do. They got a dent in the history record.
Yeah,
they did, even though it was usually getting themselves killed and their followers killed.
Right.
But yeah, all the miraculous things Jesus does, no crickets. It's crickets. We don't hear anything about it from the contemporary record.
Yeah, just in case nobody knows, Jesus is not the only claimed Jewish Messiah, even by the Jews. There are other messiahs, so just go check that out. I mean, that fact alone might just blow your mind.
There's over a dozen I talk about in the book, and those are just the ones we know about. Those are just the ones we know about.
Let me see if there's something I missed here that I want to press you on. No, we covered a lot. Okay.
Yeah.
Let
me. You know what? If you don't have a question, there's one point I do want to make before we forget, and that is why this shit matters. It's like, why should it matter to atheists whether there's a Jesus or not? And on one hand, it doesn't matter. We're going to be just fine, atheists. It's not like Christianity is going to start making sense if there was a real Jesus. But here's why it matters, is because whether there was a Jesus or not, everything that we've said in these books, in my books, Jesus, Myth, and Action, is true, whether there was an actual Jesus or not. But the fact is, the more we look into it, the crazier it is, the less sense it makes, and the more we realize that whether there was a Jesus or not, we don't need a Jesus to account for everything that we see in early Christianity. So in that sense, it's not an important question at all. But what is important, for atheists anyway, is that everything we learn from the debate between the historicists who say, oh yeah, there was a Jesus, and the mythicists who say, no, there was never a Jesus, everything we learn about Jesus in that helps us call the bluff of anybody who says, oh, well, I know how Jesus wants us to act or behave or vote.
Yeah.
And that's a huge important thing.
That is.
Plus, it's fascinating. It's fascinating. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah. David, one more question for you.
Yes.
Christians today believe in and trust their religious mentors, clergymen, pastors, and biblical scholars to nurture their personal and spiritual development. And oaths have been taken on both sides to ensure the integrity of each, okay? Why should they trust you, the Lone Ranger who stands against everything they believe in, and just take your word for it?
Well, it's not just me, for starters. I'm basically the comic relief of it. I'm the field reporter reporting from the trenches of this thing. I mean, yeah, I've got a history degree, but you know what? I don't make any claims that this is on the Dave Fitzgerald show. In fact, the mythicists that I take seriously, Robert Price, Raphael Laddister, Richard Carrier, the ones who aren't trying to say things like, oh, the Romans invented it as social control, or it started as a mushroom cult or something like that. The ones who are looking at the real history that we have and the evidence of the religious evolution that we have starting from the first century and before then, all the way up to, the later Christianity, that's when you see that if you're looking for a real Jesus, it looks pretty quickly that you're barking up the wrong tree. And what you really need to ask is, how is this religion and these religious movements, because it wasn't just like Christianity was one thing, it was just as scattered then as it is now.
Yeah.
How did all these disparate movements come about? How did they evolve? Where are the punctuated equilibrium of this evolution? And seeing how all these strands came together, and the fact that they all came together at the same time as all these other demigods and savior gods. Jews never said anything about there only being a trinity. There was only ever one God. But as soon as you got all these other demigods, all of a sudden, hey, look, God's got a son too, and it's Jesus. Yeah. And then it takes another 300 years for them to work out.
Like and subscribe. And we're back.
Like and subscribe. Working out the Trinity. That was another clusterfuck for another 300 years or more.
Okay, David, you've given us a lot to think about. Let me go over here, back one last time over to the live feed. Maddie Van Halen, kick-ass name. What's going on? Maddie Van Halen says, when I first heard that Jesus was a myth argument, I laughed. But after looking into it for the last few months, I have to agree it's very convincing.
You know what's funny about that, Maddie? Is if I said to you, let me take that back. If somebody said to me 20 years ago what I'm saying to you, it made no sense at all. It never even crossed my mind there was no Jesus until I got curious about how do we parse out the real Jesus from this legendary bullshit that got mixed in. Yeah. And in all innocence, I went looking for the real Jesus and trying to separate it out. And it's like you say, once you start looking at it, it's like, oh, there's a red flag. Here's a red flag. Here's a red flag. Yeah. And like I say in Nailed, once you start pulling on that thread, pretty soon you have no sweater left.
Makes sense. All right, everybody over in the live feed, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate everybody being on here. Go ahead and watch the ending sequence where we get somebody else's opinion. We'll hear Aaron Ra's opinion and his input on this matter. So thanks everybody for watching. If you've enjoyed this conversation between Fully Deconverted and David Fitzgerald, author of Mything in Action, Jesus Mything in Action. Gosh, I'd love that. Go ahead and hit that like button and make sure you subscribe to us. We'll have many more coming your way. And with that, David, tell our audience goodbye.
Folks, it's been real. Thanks.
Actually made a discovery. This is a great prop. I should have brought it out. Why isn't this true?
Because you can't show that it's true. Now, the best that people will come up with is say, well, did you know that they found Sodom and Gomorrah? Okay, let's say they did. Usually fictional stories will occur in real places. Not always. There's Wakanda, there's Metropolis, it happens. But usually fictional stories happen in real places. And they also found the city of Troy. Archaeologists found Troy, but that doesn't mean that Hellenism is the true religion. It doesn't verify the existence of Zeus, right? So we need something more than that. Literally every logical fallacy that has ever been employed has been used as an argument for God. And every argument for God is a logical fallacy.